Hey guys, this is Mr. G with another law studies lesson. So let's jump into it today. Today we're going to be talking about civil law and specifically tort law. So what are torts? Well, tort law deals with very controversial cases, and basically these are situations between two or more people where there is a breach of some obligation, right? This basically is a case where someone has caused harm or injury to another person, right? And so we're going to dive deep into all the different types of torts. But torts really ask two questions. One, who is liable, which we'll talk about liability, what that is. And two, how much, if anything, should the liable party pay to the victims of this tort, right? So let's go ahead and jump forward, right? Tort cases are between what we call a plaintiff and a defendant. So pretty much everything you watch on Judge Judy, Judge Joe Brown, Caso Cerrado, whatever cases you see on TV, if it's a TV judge, 9 times out of 10, it is a tort case, right? The plaintiff is the person suing the defendant in court. Basically, the plaintiff is the injured party. They're the person who had something done to them, and the defendant is the alleged wrongdoer, right? This is the person who supposedly did something to hurt the plaintiff, right? And so you'll see this all the time on court TV shows that deal with civil law as opposed to criminal law, right? And so the central idea that we talked about is who is liable. And so liability is what we call legal responsibility. It is the obligation to either do something or not to do something. So a person may be morally at fault for hurting somebody, but not necessarily civilly liable for their injuries. So for example, let's say you have a friend and you both want to apply for this job, right? But you really want to get it, and so you lie to your friend about the job interview for that job, right? And so she doesn't get to the job because you gave her bad info, and so she doesn't, get to interview, or she loses the job, or maybe she said something during your job interview that gets her to flunk out, right? So technically, you did something morally wrong to your friend in that scenario, and honestly, you should rethink your life choices because that's just, you know, kind of a bad move as a friend, right? But technically, you didn't do anything civilly wrong, right? You didn't cause her to, um, you know, get injured in any way. She didn't have the job in the first place. It's not like you got her fired from her job, right? Um, but she probably should look for new friends if this is the case, right? And so in this scenario, the lie is morally wrong and would cause harm, but it's not technically civil liability, right? And civil law only needs what we call a preponderance of evidence. So this is very different from criminal law, right? Criminal law requires that a jury or a judge find you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, which means that they need to be 100% certain that you did what you're being charged with. In a civil court, because the stakes are a bit lower, you're not being deprived of your life and liberty, right? It's only a preponderance of evidence that's necessary, right? So you just need a little bit more than 50% of the evidence in the plaintiff's favor for the plaintiff to win the case, right? And so that means that there could be evidence showing that a person didn't cause harm or didn't intend to cause harm, right? We'll get into the nitty gritties next lecture with some real life scenarios, right? And so because of this preponderance of evidence and because of the complicated nature of a tort, we kind of have to look at previous decisions, right, or what we call precedents, in order to sort of decide what should be applied in this scenario. And so tort law balances usefulness with harm. Basically, the idea behind tort law is the same idea behind civil liberties. You're free to do what you want, but as soon as you infringe on somebody else's right, you have caused them harm. Now let's dive into different types of torts. Tort liability exists in three major categories of conduct. There's intentional wrongdoing, negligence, and strict liability. Intentional wrongdoing is an action done with the intent of having either a physical or mental effect on the other person or their property, or sometimes both. So, traditional examples of this is you are mad at someone, so you decide to key their car, or you're upset with your friend, so you throw their backpack into a lake. Those are examples of intentional wrongs against someone's property, right? But intentional wrongdoing can also mean physical and mental abuse as well, right? So assaulting a person, assault and battery, hitting a person, yelling at a person, trying to intimidate or threaten a person. All these are examples of intentional wrongdoing. You're upset at the person and you're doing something because you want to have an effect on them, either physically or mentally speaking, right? And so an example that has come into public consciousness again lately is the story of singer-songwriter R. Kelly. There was a recent Netflix documentary that came out called Surviving R. Kelly, right? And so he's faced criminal charges as well as countless civil lawsuits over alleged inappropriate sexual relationships as well as assault and battery, right? And this is usually with either interns or minors. Sometimes they are both. And so in many of these cases, right, his alleged intentional wrongdoing is having a sexual relationship with a minor, right? That would be the intentional wrong. He knows it's a wrong thing to do. He knows that this is a thing. And so if he's allegedly taking these actions, right, that is the intentional wrongdoing, right? Negligence is a bit different, right? So negligence is failure to use a reasonable amount of care, right? When you're doing something, right? So basically you are not being careful enough when you are doing something, right? Which then allows somebody else to get hurt or injured, or it ends in the destruction of property of some sort, right? So for example, drunk driving and hitting a pedestrian shows gross negligence, right? So you made the decision to go out drinking without a ride home, right? And by driving drunk, you are showing gross negligence, and any harm that comes from that, you can be sued over, right? In a civil court. So if you crash your car into a mailbox, you can be sued for the price of the mailbox. If you crash into another car, you can be sued for damages as well as injuries for that injured party. Now, there are also criminal charges that go along with drunk driving, right? You get charged for DUI, you can be charged for vehicular manslaughter, or even attempted murder in some states if you are drinking and driving, depending on the state laws, right? So the lesson is just don't drink and drive, right? But there are other examples of negligence that do not involve alcohol, right? Anytime you fail to use a proper amount of care when you're doing something, for example, if you're not wearing safety gear, or if you are not taking precautions, right, you can be charged with negligence. Right? You see this in a lot of cases with parents who don't take proper care of their children. And our last sort of type is what we call strict liability. And so this is basically whenever you're dealing with something that is very, very dangerous, you bear the responsibility for any damages or injuries, even if you are not negligent, right? So some activities are so dangerous that no matter how much due care you use, no matter how much preparation and safety you put into place, if anything bad happens and it results in an injury or death or damage of any property, right? Even if you weren't negligent, you are still ultimately responsible because you are doing something that is extremely dangerous, right? So in a lot of cases, an example of this would be construction work, right? If you are demolishing a building, or if you're moving using large heavy equipment in some way, those are dangerous activities, right? And so the construction company is ultimately liable for anything that happens on that construction site, which is why even if even if workers and passersby and anybody on the construction site are wearing their protective personal equipment, their PPE, hard hats, all that kind of stuff, they can still be sued over damages and injuries caused by their construction site or demolition, something like that. Another more fun example, which we've kind of seen, if you're like me, you've seen Tiger King over this COVID-19 quarantine, right? Owning a wild animal is a strict liability. So all those people, the Carol Baskins and Joe Exotics of the world, they face strict liability for having all those tigers and lions on their property, right? Owning a wild animal, even if you properly care for it, even if you have, safety equipment and things in place, you can still be sued if your wild animal hurts anybody, right? In certain states and cities, like Miami-Dade County, for example, a pit bull is considered one of these strict liability animals, right? Different dog breeds over time, like pit bulls and Dobermans and Rottweilers have all been considered strict liability pets. So just owning one puts you in full liability. And then you have entire counties like Miami-Dade County, which have banned them outright. But next class, we'll be talking about dog bites specifically as we talk about strict liability versus, some other cases, right? And so, like I said earlier, sometimes criminal and civil cases can cross over, right? Crimes and torts sometimes get mixed into one another. So, for example, reckless driving can both be a crime and a tort if it causes harm to another, right? So you can get arrested, you can get a ticket, you can get arrested for driving recklessly, right? And if you destroy property, let's say you tear up somebody's lawn by doing donuts in it, or you wreck somebody's fence because you drive into it because you weren't paying attention, right? You can be sued for those damages, right? And so just because someone is found innocent of a crime doesn't mean that they are not liable for any damages, right? So sometimes because the burden of proof is so high in a criminal case and you need evidence beyond a reasonable doubt for a criminal activity, sometimes you end up with a case where a criminal is not convicted of the crime, but they are found guilty in civil court. An example of this happening is in the O.J. Simpson trial. O.J. Simpson was found innocent of murdering his wife and her boyfriend, but her family was able to sue him successfully for damages, right? For the loss of their daughter, right? So, that's an example where a person has not been found guilty of a criminal offense, but they are still sued successfully in a civil court because the preponderance of evidence is much lower in a civil court, right? And so this also brings us to the idea of who can be sued, right? Basically, here in the United States, almost anybody can be sued. Individuals, groups, businesses, organizations, governments, etc. Right? Most people can be sued. However, most people and most lawyers don't go after cases unless there is a defendant with what we call, quote unquote, deep pockets, right? So, for example, you might have been wronged by someone, but if that person's flat broke, well, they don't really have any money to pay you compensation for whatever damages or medical bills or whatever the case may be you might have suffered, right? In many states, minors can be sued, but this is based on the expectations for a child. So, for example, a toddler who picks up a parent's handgun and shoots someone cannot be held liable in a court of law because it's a toddler, right? However, a teenager that commits a crime can be held with a certain amount of responsibility because of their age and their experience in life, right? So they know better at that point, right? We call this the know better rule, right? At that age, should you know better than to do this? Most of the time when children are sued, most of the time it's the children's parents who are found liable for the damages caused by their children. Immunities. So, immunity is a protection from a lawsuit and liability, and not too many people have immunities, right? We're just going to go over a couple basic ones, right? So some individuals have familial immunity. So for example, spouses are often considered one legal entity, and so they cannot really sue each other in certain states, except under extreme circumstances or after a divorce, right? Uh, Minor children and parents also cannot sue each other, again, except in extreme cases such as emancipation, right? Because it's all within the family, traditionally, it's the family's responsibility to sort it out, right? But within the nuclear family, the parents and the children, right, there really isn't a whole lot of legal recourse. You have what's called familial immunity, right? Then there's different levels of governmental immunity, right? So government officials cannot be sued for carrying out their duties as long as it is within the scope of their job. Now, let's say that an officer or a government official is doing something outside the scope of their job, then yes, they can be sued for whatever, right? So, for example, if if a tax collector goes drinking and drives his car into a light post, he does not have governmental immunity because he was not acting in the capacity of his job. Excuse me. He was not acting in the capacity of his job. Another very prominent example is that police officers cannot be sued for doing parts of their jobs, right? So for example, if a police officer arrests you because they're serving a warrant, right? They have a warrant to arrest this person, right? Or there's an outstanding warrant and they arrest this person. The police officer cannot be sued for serving the warrant. They cannot be sued for your lost wages if you were arrested because you lost your job or whatever the case may be, because they're working within the scope of their jobs, right? But that being said, that does not mean that everything that these people do are outside the scope of, or are inside the scope of their job, right? Figures such as politicians and police officers and any sort of government officials, they can be sued for things that they did before they came into their office, or for things that they did while in office, however, were not part of their job. So like, for example, President Bill Clinton was sued by Paula Jones for sexual misconduct prior to becoming president, right? And so because this happened before he became president, he couldn't use presidential immunity to keep him safe from this lawsuit. All right. Another big type of lawsuit are class action lawsuits. Hundreds or thousands of injured parties involved in a case, right? A class action lawsuit is a lawsuit brought by one or more people on behalf of a larger group. So a big example of this happened in the early 2000s where BP, Gulf Oil Company, had a rig at Blue Water Horizon that exploded, causing damages to millions of people, as well as the ecosystems in the Gulf of Mexico, right? It killed plants, it killed wildlife. It basically hurt the livelihoods for anybody living on the Gulf, including us here in Florida, right? Fishermen, hotels, beaches, boat rentals, shrimpers, all these people who relied on the Gulf became part of this giant class action lawsuit to sue BP Oil over this oil spill and over the environmental disaster that resulted from their oil spill, right? But class action lawsuits happen all the time. It doesn't have to be as large as the BP oil spill. Sometimes they can be smaller cases with only a few members. All right, guys, that's all I have for you today. I hope you guys found this lesson interesting. Check out my channel for other videos on law, debate, and other social studies topics. This has been Mr. G's Classroom. Please like and subscribe and hit that little bell if you want to get notifications when new videos come out. Have a good one, guys. I'll see you next time.